Although Pennsylvania was technically considered a free state as early as the turn of the 19th century, the history is much more complicated than that. Come along a journey to Waverly, a key stop for slaves in search of freedom. The establishment and growth of the Lackawanna Railroad in the 1960s played a significant role in the history of Pennsylvania. Frequented by affluent, often white Americans traveling from New York City and beyond. But more than a century earlier, another railroad used by African Americans had deep tracks across northeast Pennsylvania. But there was no locomotive belching smoke, no railroad cars, no one shouting, I traveled with my photographer Lou and our intern Lauren to the heart of historic Waverly in the northwest corner of Lackawanna County to embark on a tour that is the only program of its kind in our region. It's called Destination Freedom, and it manifests itself as a walking tour centered around local Civil War era history. The program runs out of the Waverly Community House on North Abington Road. Come for an exclusive journey along with us through time as we showcase the stops along the walking tour.
You can see how divided people were over these issues.
We would be remiss if we did not highlight that history here.
You are on hallowed ground, and this is a very special place, and we are standing amongst heroes.
Jeremy's Journeys, Destination Freedom, Waverly's Hidden History. We started our day with Gia Tugend, Executive Director of the Waverly Community House.
And how long have you been involved in the Community House's operations?
So I have been working here since 2012. I started as an intern. Right now my job is primarily focused on keeping operations running smoothly. So the Waverly Community House has something for everyone. We're a community center that's open to the public, free and open to the public. You do not need a membership to participate in any of our programs or events. We have a gymnasium that you can rent. If you're a school group, you can play basketball in the gym. We have special events and programming, such as an artisans marketplace. We have a playground. We have a Calm Kids program, an after-school program, a Calm Camp Day summer camp for kids. We have an archive. We have a Destination Freedom program. We also have a library, a Small Works art gallery, and a thrift store. So there's a lot to do here. Oh yeah, definitely. So there's a lot to do here. We offer a wide variety of programming and events. To the public. We have a free summer concert series in the summer, so there's really truly something here for everyone.
As far as Destination Freedom, I know that you had a very indispensable role in its creation, so tell me about that.
So when I started working here as an intern, I quickly realized, along with our former executive director, Maria Wilson, that there was a lot of history here, especially in relation to the Underground Railroad. So a gentleman named Jim Remsen wrote a book called Embattled Freedom that highlighted that history. He is from the Philadelphia region, but he grew up in one of the homes that's actually on the tour. So he's very invested in the history, and he wrote the book. So myself and my former executive director, Maria Wilson, thought, we would be remiss if we did not highlight that history here. So the Destination Freedom program started with a map, a walking tour map, created in 2017 with a graphic designer, and that was the program. It quickly evolved from being a map to a map/companion reader that school districts would use, and the companion reader was designed more for teachers to bring students here and learn a little bit more information than what was just in the map.
So they played the role of EJ?
Yes, yes. So after that, it's evolved over a period of time exponentially. So it started as the map, then evolved into the companion reader, then EJ came on, started to do the guided walking tours. Then we created this gallery space that we're sitting in. And so this gallery space contains exhibit items on loan from various historical institutions in our region, such as the Susquehanna Historical Society, Lackawanna Historical Society. And so it evolved, again, to include this space. And then most recently, on Juneteenth, we premiered our placard that's out front. So that contains information, a brief overview of the Underground Railroad in our region, and then some information on the app and a QR code to download the app.
That's great work that you've done, and being able to preserve the history of this area. If you didn't preserve it, what would this be? Would there be any recognition of Waverly's critical role in the Underground Railroad?
I think it's important that we did create this program. I feel like if we didn't, I don't know what would have happened. Jim Remsen's book does touch on the Underground Railroad and the history in this region.
But it's not a activity that people can come see.
No.
It's just something you read about in a book.
Yes,
Whereas
this makes it-
preserves it
yes.
and allows people to have accessibility to it.
Yes, this makes it tangible. This allows for people to take part in the interactive nature of it. And you know, when you could see something firsthand, when you could actually look at the house that maybe housed an abolitionist, that is such an important part of being able to learn about history. It puts you in a different frame of mind. It actually makes it a little bit more real, and it's a really good learning tool. And the thing I love about it is that people of all ages can utilize this.
Now, you've said this has evolved many times.
Yes.
What's the next evolution?
So I personally would love to see us partnering a little bit more with school districts, and we've been conducting outreach to various school districts, and I love to have the kids here to learn about it. It's such a good experience. So tours are offered on a basis where during the school year you can call us, you could call me, or email me to make an appointment, but we do have someone here every Tuesday during the school year. Now, when the school is out for the summer, we do them Monday through Friday. You can come here Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 4:30. On the weekends, you can reserve a tour as long as we have enough, advance notice. I would personally love to see this program run full-time on a full-time basis all year round. So I would love to have a better reach in terms of, just the evolution of how we can offer tours. And then of course, more partnerships. Partnering with more nonprofits is always a goal of ours, and getting more schools here, because I do think it's super important for kids to learn this history as well. I absolutely do.
How much would it cost realistically for a school to be able to bring a class?
We have group rates, and we're super flexible with that. The idea is just to get them in the building. So I think our group rates start at like $100 for a large group of 20 or something like that. But like I said, we're super flexible. The idea is just to get them here to learn about the history. So we're always willing to work with school districts.
You told me about a larger class.
Right.
But if one person wanted to come on a tour and was interested, how much would it cost?
We do offer free tours on Tuesday afternoons from 2 to 3 p.m. But if they wanted to come outside of those hours, it's $10 per person.
Waverly's Destination Freedom is the only active public program in our area dedicated to preserving and sharing Civil War era history. And its home, the Waverly Community House, lovingly referred to as the COM, is more than just a venue. It's a living extension of the values it honors. The COM was founded in 1919 in memory of Henry Lewan Jr., a man whose life was marked by leadership, compassion, and a deep sense of responsibility to others. Born in West Point, New York in 1843 and educated at Yale, Lewan went on to lead as president of the Pennsylvania operations of the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company and served as director of the Scranton Lace Company. But beyond his business achievements, what set him apart was how he treated those around him. His factories were known for not just production, but for community, offering workers access to recreation, arts, and a sense of dignity rarely seen in industrial America at the time.
It was always supposed to be a community house. Henry Lewan Jr. was very passionate about providing his employees with recreational opportunities. He felt that made them happier and better motivated. So his family founded this place in his honor in order to provide educational, recreational, and cultural opportunities to the public.
It is this spirit of humanity and care that lives on through the Waverly Community House today. By hosting Destination Freedom, the COM continues Lewan's legacy, not just by honoring his name, but by preserving the stories of men and women who risked everything to ensure the safety and freedom of enslaved people. Just as Lewan valued the well-being of his workers, this program values the history of those who valued freedom, not just for themselves, but for others. In this way, the Community House stands as both a memorial and a movement, connecting past and present through shared commitment to justice, dignity, and compassion.
This is Henry Lewan Jr., and he was a very big advocate in terms of employees and their opportunities to have recreational opportunities available to them. So there was a bowling alley inside Scranton Lace. His family members, when they took over the Scranton Lace Company in his absence after he passed away, the employees were actually invited to Paul Lewan, his son's home, in the summer to swim. So it's something that he started. It was a sentiment that he started, but then it was carried on in his legacy by his family members at the Scranton Lace Factory. And I really feel like that was innovative, especially in relation to the time period, the opportunities that were afforded to employees. And just from going through this collection, when I first started here at the Waverly Community House interning, I came to find out and discover that he had a very low turnover rate in terms of his employees.
People liked it there.
Right, people liked it there.
Especially
and so,
compared to other manufacturing jobs,
yes,
right?
Yes.
People didn't have too many rights as workers.
No.
So he provided a really great workplace.
He did, and he sort of set the standard for years to come. You know, like I said, with his family members who took over, and because they knew how much he cared about, you know, recreation and recreational opportunities and about his employees. And so they really felt that a living memorial to him, a gift to the community, to give them that gift of recreation,
would embody who he is.
Absolutely.
The Scranton Lace Company was the first producer of Nottingham lace in the United States and remained the largest producer of the pattern for much of the 20th century. At its height, Scranton lace designs could be found in homes around the world. The company was also one of the largest employers of women in the United States.
The Scranton Lace Factory was a burgeoning factory in our region, and it was really the industry in our region for a number of years, right? And we also have all of the archives here. It's in the room across the hall, but there is an archive here that houses all of the lace factory personnel records, lace patterns, and it's something that we're truly working on developing. We have partnered with the Lackawanna Historical Society to house the collection, and that's another collection that we're working on developing here and making that accessible to the public as well.
These are relics from the Scranton Lace Company, right?
Yes, so we have 2 ads from the Scranton Lace Company that were actually donated to us, and they are just regarding, you know, do you know all about the beautiful Scranton goods? And I think they're really neat. I think these are such nice pieces to have on hand. This is actually my favorite one, but this is an advertisement for Scranton Lace curtains, and they were super popular for a number of years. And like I said, a lot of people that I know who have history with Scranton Lace, or their mothers or grandmothers, really loved Scranton Lace. They always talk about the curtains.
It's like a doily pattern.
Yeah.
Very cool.
A lot of doilies, a lot of tablecloths. The people that I've spoken to regarding the collection said it was everywhere at the time. Their grandmother had, you know, lace tablecloths, and it's such a important piece of our history, the Scranton Lace Company. It's still, a lot of people associate our region with that company in general.
So this was a huge part of our manufacturing business. A lot of people think about, you know, coal when they think about our region.
Oh yeah.
But nobody really thinks about lace.
No, they don't.
And that's what Beelan's whole fortune was built upon.
It was a very big part of the family's history in relation to their history in the region, but then their history with the Waverly Community House as well. Yes.
Just as the Scranton Lace Company became intricately woven into the fabric of northeastern Pennsylvania's history, the Destination Freedom Program has now been woven into the national story as well. In 2022, the Destination Freedom Program became nationally recognized, becoming part of the National Park Service network to freedom.
The process of getting on the list of the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom through the National Park Service, it was a little bit in-depth of a process. So it required a lot of citing of your sources. So yes, you can say the house across the street housed an abolitionist. Well, how do you know? Where is your information to back that up? So it took us about 3 to 4 months to compile our application. And once we did, we were able to receive the good news that we were eligible to be on the list, and there was a big announcement. So that's something we're really proud of, because I feel like it adds another element to our program. I truly feel like it's a way to nationally recognize our program, and that is so special.
A single glance into the archives makes one thing clear. The National Park recognition is just one chapter in a much larger legacy of distinction.
Do you know of any other locations here in our area that are designated with so many accolades?
I don't. I feel like the COM is a really special place. I think there's a lot of history here, and I know that other places have their own history, but it's very, very special. For instance, in this case, there are photos. So George M.D. Lewis, who was the architect of the Waverly Community House, was actually friends with Ernest Hemingway. So there are photos of Ernest Hemingway in here, and I think that that's really neat. That actually might be my favorite part of this archive.
Where is he? Do you have a picture?
Yeah, he's right here in the crutches.
Oh yeah, I see it. So did they hang out in Key West together?
I think they served together in the war, and yeah, who knows, but they were very good friends.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
After Gia set the scene for us, we were whisked on the walking tour with both program directors of the Destination Freedom Tour, EJ and Adrienne. We found some shade under a tree.
So my education background, my already working here at the COM kind of mixed into this role. I'm EJ Murphy. I'm the program manager of the Destination Freedom Underground Railroad Walking Tour Waverly program here at the Waverly Community House. I've been working at the COM for actually I don't even know how long at this point. It's been over a decade. I actually started as a counselor for the summer camp that goes on here, and over the years they kept me along. In 2017, when GIA was getting this program off the ground, it was my first year actually teaching American history. So when we started to see that there was a want for more information, we had people showing up who wanted guided tours. GIA does everything here, so she's very busy. She can't offer them every day. So when I kind of found out what the program was all about, I went to GIA and I said, hey, this is what I teach. If you need me to help out, I can give a tour if you have people who show up. And from there, I started giving the guided tours. I do it full-time in the summer when I'm not teaching, and during the school year, I am here part-time when I can be.
And you both were saying you've conducted tours in all kinds of weather, right?
Oh yeah, we do them on days like today where it's kind of sweltering, very humid, hot. I've also been out with feet of snow on the ground. So it's
even umbrellas.
Yep. So it's a year-round thing, and it's great.
With EJ's extensive knowledge in history, he went on to explain to us the inner workings of the Underground Railroad.
So our program centers around the story of the Underground Railroad, and that is the system that fugitive slaves used to escape from slavery and try to find their way to freedom. And a lot of people don't know that our area, not just Waverly, but our whole entire area, northeastern Pennsylvania, played a very important role in that system. And again, our story is centered around that.
There are many misconceptions about the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, so I have to kind of question our guests when they come here and take the tour, because you never know. We get all sorts of ranges of people who have already an understanding of this history. You have people who haven't heard about it since they were in school, and then we have children who show up who've never heard about it at all. So we do have to gauge where people's understanding is. So I start out by asking, who knows what the Underground Railroad is? And you have people who kind of raise their hands. Some people seem a little hesitant. They might remember from school, they might not. But I do have to clarify that it is not an actual railroad, and it doesn't actually go underground. Because some people, when they come to take our tour, they think that that's where the tour is going to take place, on an underground train somewhere.
In the secret language of freedom, the Underground Railroad had its own code. Those who ventured south in search of enslaved souls yearning for liberty were known as pilots. The ones who led them, step by dangerous step, were called conductors. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass are some of the best-known conductors of the Underground Railroad. But there were thousands of others who put their lives on the line. The brave men and women and children in transit were passengers, and the homes, barns, and businesses that offered them shelter under the cover of darkness, they were called stations, brief sanctuaries on a long and perilous road. These stations were transient. They vanished or appeared with the turn of a key, when a house was sold, when danger crept too close, when silence was no longer enough to keep suspicion at bay. The entire network thrived in whispers and shadows. Written records were rare, too risky. One wrong word could mean capture. For the passengers, return to chains. For the helpers, arrest. This threat hung heavy in both slave-holding states and lands that called themselves free. As for the name Underground Railroad, its origin is cloaked in legend. Some say it sprang from frustrated slave catchers right here in Pennsylvania. Others tell of a captured man in Washington, D.C., who under duress confessed that a hidden underground path led north all the way to Boston. And then there's the tale of Tice Davids, who fled across the Ohio River in 1831, vanishing without a trace. His enslaver was baffled. He returned home muttering he must have gone on an underground railroad. Whatever the truth, by the mid-1840s the name had taken hold, and with it, the legend of a silent, invisible lifeline, pulling people out of bondage towards the light of freedom.
Was it called the Underground Railroad before, like during its operation?
Yes. If you look in newspaper accounts of debates about slavery and issues surrounding slavery, the Underground Railroad does start to get used in the pre-war period. So this wasn't some term that just came up in the post-war years.
What was the general feeling towards slavery in our area? Was it sympathetic towards slaves? Were there a lot of abolitionists around?
There was a big spectrum of thought when it came to issues.
Similar to the politics of Pennsylvania now.
Very similar, yeah. And that's one thing that we do talk about as a part of our tour, because for people, even people who do know about the Underground Railroad, I think the general understanding is that these people were slaves. They used this system. They navigated the system. They got to freedom at a place like maybe Waverly or somewhere farther north. And then the story kind of ends there. And what we try to do is we try to contextualize the story and lend more to the actual experiences of the formerly enslaved people who are using it, because the story is much more complicated than people think.
Isn't it always? Pennsylvania is known as a swing state, but that political divide isn't new. Even during the Civil War era, the Commonwealth was deeply split. It's striking how even centuries later, Pennsylvania remains a place of sharply contrasting beliefs.
The big goal of our program is to give context to this nationally known story that most people have at least heard of before, and then kind of localize it a little bit. And Waverly is an important place because you can see how divided people were over these issues. Even though Waverly was a small village, it had many abolitionists who lived here, many anti-slavery advocates. You also had people in towns, just like this town, that were maybe not so sympathetic. People tend to think when you hear about, oh, Waverly is an Underground Railroad town, that everybody who lived here was absolutely on board and sympathetic and assisted, and that just wasn't the case, unfortunately. And that's an important thing to take note of, because it lends more to the experiences of the people who ended up actually living in Waverly, who navigated the Underground Railroad to this town, to show that their journey and their life beyond navigating this system was much more complicated than people tend to think. We try to connect the story of the Underground Railroad in Waverly to other parts of history that people don't tend to associate with the Underground Railroad. So we connect to the Civil War era, we connect to the war itself, we connect to the post-war years and the Reconstruction of the United States after the war is over. We also try to connect different towns. It's not just Waverly that played a part in this system. There were towns like Wilkes-Barre to the south, you have Montrose and Towanda to the north and northwest. And all of these towns, which people typically don't associate with this era of history, you're going to see large African-American communities grow because of this Underground Railroad system. And you're going to see very important people in each of these towns that are going to emerge in terms of their voice when it comes to the big national issues of the day.
Why is it that Waverly is the only place with a designated memorial to the Underground Railroad?
So luckily they have been doing a really good job of trying to memorialize the Underground Railroad, not just in northeastern Pennsylvania, but throughout the country. So you can see little tidbits of the Underground Railroad in different places.
But not necessarily Wilkes-Barre, right?
Not necessarily Wilkes-Barre. There are like historic markers that do signify the Underground Railroad in town, but in terms of active programs that highlight that history regularly, our program is pretty unique in that regard. But it doesn't mean that Waverly is the only story to be told. Like I said, there are different towns that connect in a lot of different ways. I know that the Center for Anti-Slavery Studies in Montrose for many years has done great work in bringing that history to the public. But again, just for today and our time period, lately our program is the most active when it comes to bringing this history to the public.
Pennsylvania was considered a free state as early as the turn of the 19th century, but freedom here was never guaranteed. Even in towns like Montrose, Wilkes-Barre, and Waverly, where the Underground Railroad stations offered hope, enslaved people were still hunted.
How far north did slaves have to go to be truly free?
So the ultimate goal for most people is to get to Canada. That's where, once you cross that border, the legalities of slavery, you don't have to worry about those as much. And that's one of the things that we start our tour by talking about, because it also lends to what the abolitionists who were involving themselves in this system, what they were potentially risking by getting involved. There was a constitutional mandate written into the United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, that mandated if you knew of an escaped enslaved person, or if an escaped enslaved person made their way to your town, they had to be returned to their enslaver. That was a constitutional mandate. The first Congress is going to pass laws to give this constitutional mandate a little bit of teeth. So you were risking things by participating in this system. I mean, it wasn't just a moral stand that people were taking. It was a legal one, a legal risk. And we kind of, again, start by looking at some of the houses around here. And the house that we're looking at right here is actually one of the white one. Yeah, the white one right here. Yep. Is actually one of the homes of one of Waverly's abolitionists who did participate in the Underground Railroad.
The homes along the walking tour are still lived in today by new owners, but they're the very same houses that once served as Underground Railroad stations in the 1800s. This was Leonard Batchelor's house. Batchelor was born in 1810 in Massachusetts, but moved to Waverly during his early childhood. His early career spanned the railroads and canals before he ultimately established himself in the mercantile industry. A man of notable courage and conviction, Batchelor emerged as one of the principal operatives of the Underground Railroad in northeastern Pennsylvania. Historical records attest that he played a pivotal role in aiding scores of African Americans to liberty. It is documented that Batchelor not only provided refuge to those escaping slavery, but often concealed them on his property, indeed within the very walls of this house, risking his own life to secure their freedom.
The Underground Railroad, it didn't start to really take root until the 1830s and going into like the 1840s. There were issues debated about slavery from the founding of the United States government under our current Constitution, even before that, and they continued over time. But what's going to happen over time is that these issues are going to become more and more heated, and the divide is going to continue to grow between Northerners and Southerners, slave owners and non-slave holders. And that's eventually what's going to lead to the division, but it takes a long time. So the debates start with the foundation of the country. In terms of how we think about the Underground Railroad, that system doesn't truly exist until, like I said, the 1830s, 1840s.
Got it. So
and
this house is probably from that time period.
Yeah, and that's the one really fascinating thing about our town is as you walk around, our building is the newest building on the block. The cornerstone was laid in 1919, it officially opened in 1920. All the buildings and homes that you see as you walk around the square that we're about to walk around, they're all from the 19th century. And it's a really interesting way to not only see kind of what the houses looked like, but you get an idea of how the town grew and developed over time. Some of the homes, like this one right here, you see the 1859 above the door. That's actually the year that the house was built. That's not the house number.
I see.
So as you walk around, not every house has one of those markers, but as you walk around, you can kind of get an idea of how the town developed. So for example, that's an 1859 home. This one I believe is 1848, and there is a marker right behind the tree that's right there. Over on the corner here, that's an 1870s home. So as you're walking around and taking the tour, you can get a sense of how the town changed and developed over time.
As we continued the walking tour, EJ pointed out a house that wasn't quite a station, but a place of healing.
So like I said, 1848, this home right here, and again, just to give a little context, this used to be, and during this time period, was a doctor's office. So Waverly at the time is a very rural farming village. So you have the two doorways here. One side of the home is the house, one side of the home is your practice, yeah.
The doctor who lived here was likely involved with the anti-slavery movement in Waverly. He may have treated injured freedom seekers, but stopped short of offering them shelter.
And that's the one thing that kind of goes to what I talked about before about the spectrum of people. You could be an anti-slavery advocate and you could be an abolitionist, but you could also not necessarily approve. Exactly, because you know that it's a legal thing. So if you're someone who is a law-abiding citizen, even though you might have anti-slavery feeling, you might not want to take that risk of involving yourself.
Makes sense.
While some residents stayed uninvolved, many offered quiet support. So quiet, in fact, that only a handful of verified helpers have ever been identified in Waverly's Underground Railroad.
Two people that we've seen enough documentation of over time to verify that they actively participated.
What kind of verification do you find?
So there's
anything that was preserved could have been used against them to turn them into a criminal.
And that's why the Underground Railroad is such a difficult thing to study, because it was a secretive system. So there isn't a whole lot of documentation. So what you have to do is you have to look over time at the different sources that you can gather and then see what's consistent and what's not. So for example, you will have in the post-war, the immediate post-war years is when people started openly discussing their involvement, because now you no longer have to worry about the legalities.
Many of the first written accounts of involvement came from local newspapers, often in fragments, sometimes just a name or a single line, enough to suggest a deeper story hiding between the headlines.
Then over time what you see is local histories are written. We actually have one called This is Waverly, and it highlights some of the individuals who were supposedly involved in this system. You would then also have to go back, once you get some of the core names that you're starting to see kind of pop up over time, then you got to go back to the time period and see what kind of documentation you could kind of drum up because of that. So for example, the two people that we know that were involved, they were mentioned in newspaper accounts in the immediate kind of post-war years and then going into the 1900s. They were both mentioned in local histories. And then they were both members of, so this is just an example, there was a political party in the 1840s called the Liberty Party. This party was based solely on the abolition of slavery. That's what the main party platform was. The two people who were involved in the system here in town were also registered. Were not even just members of the party; they were active candidates on their party ticket for different offices. So you have to track over time how all these things connect and what makes sense.
But even with names in the records, proving someone's involvement in the Underground Railroad isn't easy. Secrecy was the point, and in many cases, the truth was buried with them.
There are some documentation in local histories that have names that I've seen pop up a couple times, but never in a direct reference to the Underground Railroad. So we have people who were members of this Liberty Party, who we know were anti-slavery advocates, abolitionists, but we don't know if they actively participated in the Underground Railroad. I see. So that's why, again, when people come here, they expect me to like kind of point out every single house and say abolitionist, 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 Underground Railroad house. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Again, it's a hard story to put together, which is what makes this program unique, is because it is difficult to tell a cohesive story that actively keeps the center, what you're trying to tell, like Waverly's story. To keep Waverly the center of that could be difficult if you have like fragmented information, but because we have enough documentation that showed how important that system was to this area, we have a way to be able to tell a cohesive story that connects in a lot of different ways.
The next stop on the tour is the town's church.
So this is Waverly's United Methodist Church. Obviously, churches and the people who are congregating in them are going to play a role in how towns like this face the issues surrounding, slavery and the Underground Railroad. And what a lot of people don't know, even people who are from this area, is that the United Methodist Church here has a little hidden cemetery that's kind of in the background of this home that's right behind us. And in this cemetery is buried the first formerly enslaved person to actually make their way to Waverly and end up staying here and settling here instead of moving on to somewhere farther north.
Was it hidden on purpose?
No, it wasn't. So this home is an 1870s home. As you can see, the United Methodist Church Cemetery started burials in 1843. So this is 1843, actually is right around the time that the Underground Railroad is actually really starting to become a nationally talked about issue. So that home wasn't there. So this plot was owned, and I believe the cemetery is still owned and operated by the Methodist Church. So it wasn't hidden on purpose. This home was built, a little bit after people.
Because I'm thinking, you want to hide a lot of what you're doing as far as the Underground Railroad. You want to hide where they're buried too.
Well, you would think that. So if it's someone who's buried maybe while they're living in Waverly, while these issues are going on, that would be the case. That actually didn't really happen very often. Some of the headstones are so old that they were actually falling apart. Some of them actually got modern replacements, as you can see here. The Methodist Church does have the records for who is buried here, so thankfully, if anything were to happen to the headstones, we still know who is actually buried here.
As we stepped deeper and deeper into the cemetery, we came face to face with a remarkable thread in Waverly's Underground Railroad story. The resting place of one of the first escaped slaves to call this town home.
This right here is the headstone of George Keyes. And George Keyes was the first formerly enslaved person to come to Waverly and actually settle here.
And he's buried right here.
And he's buried right here. And again, little hidden cemetery and kind of in someone's backyard. A lot of people have no idea. Even people who are from the town don't know this is here. So at this point, what we do is we try to give context to his life. Because again, what I kind of mentioned before about this idea of most people thinking they were slaves, they navigated the system, they got to a place like Waverly, and they were free, and that's where the story ends. Well, George's story tells us that it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's more to it than just they were slaves and then they became free. So George escaped slavery in Maryland in, again, the mid-1800s. We don't know exactly when. Again, fragmented stories, oral histories over time. So about 1844, 1845, Keyes escaped slavery in Maryland. Eventually, he's going to navigate his way to northeastern Pennsylvania. At first, he settles, I've read different accounts that he actually settled in either Harrisburg or Wilkes-Barre first. And eventually he finds out, on the word of people who are sympathetic to the cause, that he has slave catchers who have been hired to try to bring him back into slavery. So he finds this out.
Just him.
So
They're looking
directly for him. These were people who were hired by George's former enslaver, who wanted to bring him back into bondage.
Is that where the term bounty hunter came from?
Yeah, so that was exactly what they were called back then, yeah. Bounty hunter is used in a lot of different ways. That could also be a legal term for like the, basically just the law, trying to find any fugitive from any law. So he hears word about this, and then he has to make a decision of what to do next. So he decides that he's gonna try to move on. Now, all of these towns are connected by people who know each other and who know who's sympathetic and know where a safe place to go is. So Keyes hears about a local Waverly resident named Rodman Sisson. See that White House?
Yeah, on the corner.
Right in the corner. That is the home of Rodman Sisson. But Sisson, like a lot of the other Waverly residents, they have homesteads and barns and things in different parts of the area. So Keyes here makes his way to Rodman Sisson's homestead, which at the time was out near Keystone College, so the Little Plume area today. And while he's there, he has to, again, try to find Sisson's home, knock on the door, and you hope, again, a lot of this is a hope and a prayer, you hope that he is sympathetic and is going to help you out.
Right. Otherwise, he'd turn him in.
Exactly. Or turn him in, or say,
These are high stakes.
or say, hey, good luck somewhere else. I'm sorry, I can't help you.
Okay.
So Keyes knocks on the door. Sisson, who is one of Waverly's staunch abolitionists, brings him into the home and hides him in one of the chimneys in the home. You hear a lot of these fantastical stories of like bookcases that moved to the side and underground, passageways and things like that did happen. But in areas like Waverly, these rural areas, you're going to hear more common stories like a chimney or maybe an outhouse or a barn or things like that. So Keyes is being hid in this fireplace. And later in the night, another knock on the door. Because just like you have sympathizers that are in these connected towns, you also have people who are not so sympathetic, who know who's involved in the anti-slavery movement, who's involved in the abolitionist movement, so they can kind of pin down if people are navigating from one place to the next, where are they going and who are they trying to run into.
That second knock on Rodman Sisson's door came from slave catchers, sent to drag George Keyes back to the plantation he had fled. Now Sisson faced a choice. Would he open the door and uphold a law rooted in the United States Constitution, or defy it and harbor a man fleeing bondage?
Because now all of a sudden you might have a target on your back as someone who could potentially be harboring a fugitive slave and breaking the law. So Sisson brings the slave catchers in, and they do a search of the first floor of the home. They don't find Keyes, they're satisfied, they move on. Now this is typically, again, decision time, especially if you're George Keyes. Do you continue to move north, all right, and try to get closer to that Canadian border, or do you feel safe enough to stay here? Well, Sisson eventually is with the assistance of his family, including his daughter Esther, whose husband is going to own property that many of the former slaves are actually going to eventually settle and live on here in Waverly. Sisson decides that Keyes is going to be sent here to the town, and again, typically this is where you'd see maybe a night or two being spent, resting, meal, and then moving on. Keyes decides that it's safe enough here. So eventually what's going to happen, Keyes is going to settle. He meets a freeborn African-American woman named Hannah Fields in northeastern Pennsylvania, and they're going to settle here in Waverly. And they're going to be the founding family of Waverly's African-American community. And from there, the African-American community in Waverly is going to continue to grow. And a lot of it is because of this Underground Railroad system that is bringing former slaves to the area.
Now, this is after the Civil War?
This is before the Civil War.
So there's an African-American community growing here in Waverly.
Yes.
Pre-Civil War, despite all of the unsympathetic people
Correct.
that are around.
Yes, absolutely. And this is not the only time that happens. Wilkes-Barre has a very large black community during this time period as well. Montrose and Towanda both also do.
Why were the bounty hunters not coming to find them?
So they were actually. That was an active thing that residents of these different towns had to worry about. We actually mentioned there were a couple different newspaper articles I found about meetings that were held in Montrose by the local abolitionist community who were indignant about the idea of slave catchers coming to the area to try to take people who had been living in the community for a very long time in certain circumstances, living industrious lives and being contributing members of the community, and being sent back into this system that many of the people in these towns abhorred. So it was a regular thing that the black communities of northeastern Pennsylvania during this time period was a regular thing that they had to worry about. And this issue actually gets worse over time. In 1850, there's a new fugitive slave law that gets passed that actually gives more teeth to the original fugitive slave clause of the Constitution. And the 1850 law basically mandated Northerners to actively participate in catching slaves if they were to be found in the towns that you were residing in. So yeah, this fugitive slave issue is going to affect many of the different communities in northeastern Pennsylvania, including here in Waverly.
I can't imagine having to live that way, under the constant threat of being caught.
And so one of the primary source documents, one of the documents that we have right from the time period, was a letter written by a Waverly abolitionist to a very prominent Montrose politician, basically asking for organized resistance to this new fugitive slave law. And in the letter, he actually describes because most of the black community were working as laborers on the farms in the area. They're talking about how the black residents are going to their work with pistols and weapons because they don't know at any point in time, is someone going to show up and try to take me? Yeah, and it was something that was a constant fear.
But he was able to...
He felt that it was safe enough to make a life here, as are many, many former slaves, and not just former slaves, but also freeborn African Americans who are either going to be born here or come here when they learn that there is a black community building in the area. So Keyes is going to be kind of the founding father of that community. And eventually all these issues leading up to the Civil War are going to boil over, and then the war is going to break out. And this is where, again, another part of the history that people I don't think expect to hear when they come to take our tour, is that George here, there's a reason that he has an American flag next to his headstone. Keyes and a small contingent of men, both freeborn and former slaves, are going to join the ranks of the United States military.
Fighting, of course, for the Union.
Fighting for the Union. At the beginning of the war, African Americans are not allowed to serve in an official capacity. Eventually, they do allow for African American enlistment. And not only is Keyes going to join, but so is his son, George Jr. George Jr. is the only member of the Keyes family that we have an actual photograph of. So Keyes Sr. and Keyes Jr. are both going to enlist in the 22nd USCT, which is a designation that you can see on the headstone here. The USCT stands for the United States Colored Troops, and this was the official designation of African American regiments during the Civil War, most African American regiments during the Civil War. And Keyes and his son are going to see action at a very integral part in the war. This is when Ulysses S. Grant is going to try to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Not just comprised of northeastern Pennsylvanians, but this unit is comprised of freeborn men and formerly enslaved men from all over the Northeast, and some former slaves who are born in areas that these men are going to go back down south and fight in. So it's a very momentous shift when it comes to American society, American culture, our government, our military. This was a big shift, and Keyes and this small contingent of men from Waverly are going to play a big part in that shift.
From a man hiding in the shadows of a small Pennsylvania town to a valiant soldier fighting on the front lines of freedom, George Keyes' journey was far from over. The year is 1864. George and his son from Waverly were now part of the push to capture Petersburg, a strategic stronghold just outside the Confederate capital of Richmond. Fighting alongside more than 600 formerly enslaved men from New Jersey, the 22nd United States Colored Troops moved in and quickly gained recognition for their fearless combat on the front lines.
And they get a lot of attention because in these initial attacks on Petersburg, it's overall unsuccessful. It becomes a siege. It takes months and months. Eventually, Richmond and Petersburg both fall. Eventually, the war ends. But during these initial attacks, the 22nd is one of the few units to actually capture Confederate ground and Confederate positions. So
and both George and his son
were
part of it.
Both George, his son, and then 4 other men from Waverly were also in that one specific unit. This is the headline from the Philadelphia Inquirer in the aftermath of the attacks on Petersburg. As you can see here, quote, "Colored troops win laurels."
And one of those was George.
And one of those was George. This Pittsburgh paper went so far to say that this was the greatest day's work of the war.
Wow.
Now, to contextualize this statement, this is after the Battle of Gettysburg and after a lot of the really famous battles that people know about when you talk about the Civil War. So the fact that contemporaries were talking about how important this was, and the fact that George and his son and the other contingent of Waverly men were a part of this was a really, really big deal. And this is also going to, you're going to see in illustrated journals. This is from Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper. These are members of the 22nd USCT hauling off captured Confederate artillery. And what's really unique about this picture is that in the background you can see a white unit of soldiers cheering them on. And this is a big deal because at the beginning of the war, and then when the debates,
they weren't even allowed.
African Americans weren't even allowed, but you had white soldiers who were essentially saying, we will leave the military before we share a battlefield with black men. That's how deeply ingrained the racial prejudice was in terms of the thinking of black men as soldiers. A lot of white soldiers did not trust that black soldiers would be capable soldiers on the field. So you had white soldiers who were essentially saying, we'll throw down our arms and leave the military before we fight on the same battlefield. This shows that there is a major sea change of thinking, not just in the military, but this is going to permeate into society and American culture. And men like George Keyes Jr. are going to use their wartime experience to fight for civil rights in the post-war years, specifically the right to vote, to say, we fought for this country, we protected the flag of this country, therefore we should be endowed with all of the rights guaranteed to citizens of this country. And it's going to be a long fight. It's going to take quite a while for voting rights to be returned to African American men here in Pennsylvania. But eventually that happens, and you start to see again kind of the fruits of what a lot of men like George Keyes probably were thinking about when enlisting in the military, going to fight the war, and then coming home after the war was over. So yeah, it's a very important unit in the military. Again, if you're a military historian, we have a lot of that here for you as well. But it's a part of the story of the Underground Railroad that people don't often connect with that system.
Their courage at Petersburg stood as a powerful symbol and a testament to the resolve of the Keyes family. But what happened after the gunfire faded? Did George and his son both return to Waverly, to the town that once hid them and now held their future?
Eventually, Keyes and his son both survived the war. They returned to Waverly. Keyes Sr., unfortunately, was wounded during the war, and as a result of his wounds, he dies 2 years after the war is over in 1867. Eventually, George Jr. Makes his way to Scranton, and this is one of the connections that we try to make with this time period that people see as separate. You have the pre-war period, the war period, then you have the post-war period, and people try to separate those. Well, the story of the Keyes family kind of shows how all of those things are interconnected. George Jr., when he makes his way to Scranton, is going to get involved in business and political circles. He's the coachman for Ira Tripp, who is the Tripp family is a very famous name for the Scranton area. He's going to get involved in the newspaper industry in Scranton, so he becomes a very prominent member of Scranton's black community. And kind of like how his father was the foundation for Waverly's black community in the mid-1800s, well, in the early 1900s, Keyes and other men from areas like Waverly are going to be the foundations for Scranton's black community. And it goes to show that these time periods, even though we tend to, in a textbook, they separate them, for people like the Keyes, they lived through it all, and they were what represented it all, and they played a very heavy hand in what was going on, both locally and nationally. And that's something that a lot of people don't really think about when they think about our history.
Even as George Keyes returned as a victor and built a life in Waverly, the world around him was far from united. Not everyone in Waverly was on the same side of history. The walking tour reveals a community deeply divided, a town where neighbors debated, disagreed, and sometimes defied one another over slavery and the Underground Railroad. Just like Pennsylvania today, the town was a place of clashing beliefs, a microcosm of a swing state, a purple patchwork of conscience, conflict, and conviction. Some in Waverly fought hard to keep black residents from fully participating in the democracy that they had risked their lives to defend.
One of the big things that we try to do here is context. What was the world that George Keyes was walking into here in Waverly? What did that actually look like and operate like? And in order to kind of see how things were going to play out, you have to look at a couple of important events in the late 1830s that are going to highlight the racial views of Northerners, particularly people here in northeastern Pennsylvania. The first instance is a court case. In 1835, a man named William Fogg is going to go out to the polls to vote in Scott Township. He is going to be denied at the polls by the local elections inspector named Hiram Hobbs. William Fogg is a mixed-race African-American man. So he is denied at the polls by the elections inspector. And eventually this case is going to go to court. Locally, it goes before Judge David Scott. He's the namesake of Scott Township, so if you're familiar with the area. Judge David Scott rules in favor of William Fogg, and he cites the U.S. Constitution and the Pennsylvania Constitution and the lack of racial qualifications for voting that are not mentioned in those documents. You had to be a male, you had to be of a certain age, you had to meet other requirements, but there was no racial barrier to voting. So, locally, Judge Scott rules in favor of William Fogg and says he has the right to vote. It got appealed at the local level, and as a result of the appeal, it then gets kicked up to the state Supreme Court, where it goes before Chief Justice John Bannister Gibson, who is the namesake of Gibson, Pennsylvania. So again, familiar with the area. He has a slightly different opinion than Judge David Scott did. At the state Supreme Court, Chief Justice Gibson issues the court's decision where not only do they strike down the right to vote for William Fogg, but they actually use the term caste in their official Supreme Court decision to make it known that in their view, African Americans were a caste. They were a ring of society lower than white citizens who did not have the rights that white citizens had. Now, while this court case is going on, our state holds a state convention to look at the state constitution. And they're going to debate a lot of different things, but suffrage becomes one of the more consequential issues that's going to be debated. At the convention, there are going to be delegates sent from all over the state to represent their areas at this convention. And the home that we're looking at right behind us here, this 1826 home, is the home of Dr. Andrew Bedford. And Bedford,
This is a doctor back there.
so he's a doctor, right?
This is a well-off neighborhood. You have lots of doctors.
So you did. It was the people.
Even though it was rural.
The people who settled here early on were very industrious. So Bedford, he becomes known as a local physician, but he eventually gets involved in politics, in business, in railroads, and he's going to be one of the delegates at this convention. And at the convention, he is going to actively support the idea of inserting the word white into the state constitution to make it known that it is white men who meet all of the other requirements that have the right to vote. He's not the only representative from northeastern Pennsylvania who is going to do so at this convention. This is a man named George Washington Woodward. He made his name in Wilkes-Barre as a judge. He becomes, again, very ingrained in local politics. He's also going to be a representative at this convention where he's going to give a very lengthy speech supporting the idea of inserting the word white into the Constitution. And in this speech, this is the first paragraph of this very lengthy speech that he gives at this convention, but he basically echoes the arguments that are being made by Chief Justice Gibson and Hiram Hobbs, the elections inspector at the local level, basically saying that African Americans were not there when the Constitution or state constitution was formed, therefore they're not part of the political process. And these arguments at the convention win out. Now they have to appeal to the citizens of the state of Pennsylvania to ratify this new constitution. So they take to the papers, and you can see here their names. You got George Woodward right here,
There's Bedford.
Andrew Bedford. And they have to try to convince the citizens why these changes are necessary and why they should be approved. And in their appeal to the voters, they take to local newspapers to do this. You can see here that same argument. They are a caste. So this is all based off on where white citizens believed African Americans fit in American society. And as we mentioned before when we talked about Keyes and the 22nd USCT and their military experience kind of shifting changes of mind in the military, you're going to see this type of thinking start to really erode when you start to see, again, especially during the Civil War, black men go off to fight and then prove their worth as not just citizens, but human beings, really.
White voters held all the power, and the way they used it, especially at the ballot box, shaped the future for enslaved and for free black people alike.
One of the easiest ways to tell how divided areas are is to see how the voting population of areas voted. So here I have the Luzerne County 1860 presidential election results and 1864 presidential election results. At the time, Lackawanna County does not yet exist, so Luzerne and Lackawanna are just one big county. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is going to get about 7,300 votes in this county, and the Democratic ticket is going to get about 6,800 votes. So Lincoln wins this county, but it's not a huge margin of victory. He wins by a couple thousand, but it's not a massive margin. Again, pretty divided, right? They break them down by town. Waverly, 35-32
Extremely
in
close.
favor of Abraham Lincoln. So very close. Then you have the election of 1864. A lot of people forget that Abraham Lincoln actually had to run for re-election while the war is going on. And a lot of U.S. citizens are going to go out and they're going to vote based off of how they think Lincoln is doing prosecuting the Civil War. So in 1864, in Luzerne County, Lincoln is going to get about 6,600 votes. The Democratic ticket is going to get about 9,500 votes. So in 1864, Luzerne County actually flips and votes pretty heavily against Abraham Lincoln.
What about Waverly?
Waverly, I'm glad you asked that question. Waverly, 29-28 against Abraham Lincoln. So imagine being the one, Republican who stayed in bed and didn't decide to go to the polls that day, right? Even in these communities where you have the abolitionists, you have the anti-slavery advocates, you have these growing black communities, even though they have no political rights at this point in time.
There were a lot of morphing mindsets.
There were a lot of morphing mindsets, and it just goes to show that it wasn't a universal train of thought. And that's an important thing to think about when you think about all the issues that we've talked about as we've been walking around today.
Think of people as stagnant.
Exactly, or that there's this one side and this other side. There's a lot of in between, and Waverly's just like there is today. So not only doesn't it give you an idea of how we got to where we're at in our current day politics, it can also show that like I said, the stories that we often hear, maybe some of the misconceptions that we have in our heads, they kind of muddle the story a little bit, and it makes it so that the story gets lost. And what we try to do here is to try to bring that story back and give it its proper context.
To give further context to the story and to show how complex it truly was, Dr. Bedford, the same man who actively lobbied to restrict African Americans from voting in the 1830s, became a friend to the formerly enslaved following the Civil War. There is evidence that over the decades his feelings changed regarding the issue. And in a town marked by bitter divisions over freedom and rights, one place stood apart. A single schoolhouse where, unlike much of the rest of the country, black and white children once learned under the same roof, more than a century before the Civil Rights Movement. It's here that a new voice on the Walking Tour picks up the story.
And when the COM started their tours in 2017, and E.J. Murphy is a very busy man, they needed some backup for him to run field trips and things like that. So I stepped in kind of as his assistant. I'm a local mom of 3. I could walk to my house from here. I'm also, for 15 years, I've been an adoption specialist at Friendship House in foster care adoption. My name is Adrienne Hine. I'm program coordinator of Destination Freedom Underground Railroad walking tours at the Waverly Community House. I've always been interested in history, not in school, but as an adult. So when I moved here about 24 years ago, I had heard the stories of the Underground Railroad here. There wasn't a lot of documentation at the time, but I would read whatever I could find. One book was written by a local woman in 1954. I read that, whatever I could find. And I was writing for the Abington Journal just as a side job, and I asked the editor there if I could write some stories. So I wrote a story about the Hickory Grove Cemetery. I wrote a story about the cemetery behind the Methodist church that we visited.
And we have another part of the tour here behind us.
Yes.
Tell me about the schoolhouse.
So the Fell Schoolhouse is built in 1820 by the Fell family who lived next door. The Fell family, John Fell, was known to be a radical abolitionist. But where it gets interesting is when the formerly enslaved started to stay in Waverly. So we had men working the fields, fixing things, doing all kinds of work to gain money to either stay here or move north. And they were welcome in the school. During their lunch break, you might see...
Was that unconventional?
Oh yeah, very different in this community. They would sit in the back during their lunch break, learn the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s. They were allowed to learn to read and write. It was amazing. And then when our community started to build, formerly enslaved decided to stay in Waverly. It was integrated from day one for the children.
This was one of the first cases in Pennsylvania of white and black residents cooperating in organized education together.
It gets even more interesting when the black community wanted to build their own church. Some of the folks were going to the Methodist church, the Baptist church, the Presbyterian church, but they wanted to form their own, and they wanted to form the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. So while they're saving money to build their own church, of course, John Fell and the community said, have your services here at the schoolhouse. So this is actually the first worshiping gathering place of the African Methodist Episcopalian residents of Waverly. Then, as they continued to work and save money, John and Esther Sisson-Stone, farmers, they sold them a plot of land
to build the new church.
To build the new church, which was the AME Church in Waverly. This is a picture of what was, now it fell into disrepair, this is many years later, but it was really a busy place. People would actually come from miles and miles around. They would have summer camp meetings, all kinds of revivals. The townsfolk, the white residents of Waverly loved to go and observe because it was so interesting to see these people worshiping with such joy because they were finally had the freedom to worship on their own terms.
Was the schoolhouse also used as a schoolhouse while it was being used as a church while they were building the other one?
Yes, so it was a schoolhouse and it was open for all kinds of denominations to worship there. And then the community really supported the development of the AME Church. The Methodist Church actually helped them raise their money. People came from all around the community, other areas to celebrate there. Joanna Raymond was the Sunday school teacher at the AME Church, and of course she was a white resident who had supported the black folks coming to town, and she was their Sunday school teacher. There's also a lot of evidence of when the formerly enslaved Civil War soldiers came back to town, often with very bad wounds. You know, we didn't have antibiotics at the time, so it was very often a very painful rest of your life. We have documentation of the local doctors and citizens, prominent citizens, writing affidavits to try to get that pension for them, the disability pension.
Mm-hmm. The schoolhouse and church stood as rare examples of what was possible. A place where some white residents took real risks to treat their black neighbors with dignity. And that commitment didn't end with life. The final stop on our tour takes us to one of the oldest cemeteries associated with African Americans in Northeast Pennsylvania, Hickory Grove. Established in 1807 and quietly serving as a burial ground for more than 70 fugitive slaves during and after the Civil War. Familiar names can be found here. Andrew Bedford, Rodman Sisson's family members, the Fell family, and William Johnson became the first reverend of the AME Church. And as soon as the African American men were allowed to join Union forces, he preached from the pulpit, "Fight and forever you will be free." An entire line of graves of formerly enslaved Civil War soldiers, adorned with American flags and GAR stars, indicating their involvement with the Grand Army of the Republic, a veterans group from the Civil War. The graves mark individual lives, but together they form a story that this town is still telling. Standing in that cemetery among the graves of the formerly enslaved and those who stood with them, it is hard not to reflect. So before the tour ended, I asked the historians a few final questions, not about facts or dates, but about feeling.
So my question to you is, working in Waverly, do you ever transport yourself mentally back in time to what it would have been like back then?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard not to with how well preserved Waverly is and just the way that the town still looks like it did back in the 19th century. It's hard not to do that, and it's one of the things that I think a lot of our guests feel, especially people who are from the area. It gives them a new perspective on an area that they've probably been to and have seen before, but after learning a little bit about what our Waverly's history is, I think it's hard not to immerse yourself in what that time period was like and try to put yourself in those shoes.
You hope that you would be as brave as the abolitionists were, but I do often, I live very close to here, and I'm often in my kitchen looking out the window and thinking, what happened here hundreds of years ago? And it's so amazing. It's hallowed ground. When we walk up at the cemetery and we're walking amongst the graves of the abolitionists and the formerly enslaved, I have such reverence, and sometimes it's quiet, and you're so thankful for people like that in history. The children tend to understand that. They rarely need a reminder from their teachers when they're on a field trip up at the graveyard to have respect and realize that you are on hallowed ground, and this is a very special place, and we are standing amongst heroes.
History isn't just something we learn. It's something we stand on. In Waverly, you don't have to look hard to find it. It's in the stones, the streets, the stories. And in the stillness of a cemetery, you realize some of the loudest lessons are spoken softly from the ground beneath your feet. Because in a town once and still divided, bravery doesn't always come in shouts. Sometimes it came in whispers, in choices, and in the quiet courage of those who stood for justice when it mattered most. The names on the gravestones may fade with time, but the legacy they left behind doesn't. In Waverly, the past isn't buried. It's alive in the questions we ask and the stories we share. These stories of George Keyes, of Rodman Sisson, of the children who shared a classroom and the families who share a cemetery might have been lost to time. But because of a few kind people in Waverly today, they're not. Thanks to the stewards at the Waverly Community House, a place built on education, on preservation, and on the belief that history is something we must keep alive. And in that way, it's a continuation of what happened here long before. Because it was also just a few brave, moral, stubbornly hopeful people who once hid fugitive slaves, defied the law, and held the door open to freedom in this town. Waverly's story, of course, isn't one of perfection, but it is one of possibility. It reminds us that in every generation, it only takes a few to stand up, to speak out, and to choose what's right, even when it's hard. And in a Commonwealth long known for its divisions, a place forever swinging between conscience and conflict, there are still those who choose courage, those who choose love, those who remind us that purple places aren't torn, they're textured, and in their tension, they hold the power to transform. Jeremy's Journeys, Destination Freedom, Waverly's Hidden History.